Hi, my name's Taylor McCreary, and I'm a first-year student at Bowling Green State University, and for my honors critical thinking class, we had to choose one book to review, and I chose Trans, Gender and Race in an Age of Unsettled Identities by Rogers Brubaker. I wanted to review this book because since I am a psych major, I do have a little bit of knowledge on the trans community, but I've never heard the term transracial, and to inform myself, I thought this would be a good way to do so. Brubaker uses two well-known people from the trans community that identify as transgender, Caitlyn Jenner, and transracial, Rachel Dolezal. But before I talk about what exactly that means, I want to talk about the setup of the book a little bit. Now, one thing I didn't like about this book was that there was only an introduction, 5 chapters, and then a conclusion. It made all the chapters hold a lot of information that were very complicated and heavy concepts that weren't necessarily simplified, which made the book harder to process. With that being said, with everything Brubaker did say, he seemed very credible when saying it because he references everything in the back of his book. One thing I did like about the setup of this book is that the first part is thinking about trans and then the second part is thinking with trans. Now I know what you're thinking. What does it mean to be transgender and transracial? Well, the term transgender is describing the gender variance one can identify with, and the term transracial is describing the race variance one can identify with. Now, those two terms pose two important questions in this book. Can one legitimately change one's race, and can one legitimately change one's gender? And there's 4 positions one can take on the matter. And to describe these positions, we use the terms essentialism, which means that identities are grounded in nature and history and cannot be changed, and voluntarism, which means that identities can be changed. And with that being said, there are 4 positions someone can take on this matter. The first position is if one thinks one can change their gender and race, they would have a voluntarist view. If one thinks one cannot change their gender and race, they would have an essentialist view. But if one thinks one can change their gender but not their race, they would have the perspective of gender voluntarism but race essentialism. And on the flip side of that, if one thinks one can change their race but not their gender, they would have the perspective of race voluntarism and gender essentialism. I thought it was interesting that Brubaker points out that most people take on the position of having a perspective of gender voluntarism but race essentialism. This brings up an important concept of boundary work. Basically, what they were saying is Dolezal was living a lie and was opportunistic and chose her race, while Jenner was being authentic and being true to her innermost self and just was her gender. But I say, who is to say that? I believe most people, such as myself, take on this position simply because we are ignorant to what it actually means to be transracial. This brings us to Brubaker's next point in his book, the reason why he is comparing Jenner and Dolezal, that if Jenner, then Dolezal. This simply states that if we accept Caitlyn Jenner as a woman, that we would need to accept Rachel Dolezal as a member of the Black community. This was to allow others to be more open to the idea of being transracial simply because being transgender was already being embraced and had lots of publicity. I think this brings up a good point that comparing the two situations can also hurt both claims. Jenner came out on her own while Dolezal was outed by her parents. I believe that this could make her seem more deceptive than she really was and misrepresent what being transracial really is. And with that being said, I believe that this can make one question whether or not being transgender should be embraced simply because they don't agree with being transracial. Whatever your position may be on the matter, Brubaker deems it important to not only think about the trans, but with the trans. And there are 3 different forms that one may identify with. The first form of trans is the transimmigration. This is to mean that there are clear categories and there is movement from one to another. You can think of this as like picking sides. What this means for somebody who is transgender means that there is a permanent movement from one gender to another. This is usually through the assistance of medical procedures such as gender reassignment. But it gets tricky when we talk about what it means for somebody who is transracial, since it is not defined legally or socially as of right now. The next form of trans is the trans of between. This is recognizing categories but not placing oneself within them. And within this form, there are different concepts to it as well. There is oscillation, recombination, and gradation. Oscillation and recombination are the ways of enacting the trans of between, but gradation is the way of understanding and representing the trans of between. A possibility of oscillation to somebody who identifies as transgender could be cross-dressing, while a possibility of recombination could be possessing qualities of a male and a female. What gradation means to somebody who identifies as transgender means recognizing it as a spectra and not limiting somebody to only identifying as feminine or masculine or a male or a female. Recognizing that they could be somewhere in between. A possibility of oscillation to somebody who identifies as transracial is something once called professional passing, which was when African Americans were able to work jobs reserved solely for whites without backlash. And a possibility of recombination is genetic recombination, which is when the child is a mixture of both of their parents. What gradation means to somebody who identifies as transracial is recognizing the intermediate positions on the skin color continuum. The last form of trans is the trans of beyond, and this is simply not recognizing any categories. And what this means to somebody who identifies as transgender means to not identify with a gender or simply not acknowledge one. And what this means to somebody who identifies as transracial means to not identify one within a race or an ethnicity simply because they feel unclassifiable or politically opposed. Interesting enough, both instances both have labels that illustrate the beyond, such as genderqueer or multiracial, because it does not acknowledge what category to put oneself in. But eventually, this is going to turn into its own category itself, and there will possibly be more forms of trans to come. It is safe to say that this is a very relevant topic for today's society, and that whatever position that you take on the matter, everyone has the right to identify with who they think they are, and that we need to respect each other for that. I hope that you decide to read this book and become more educated on the matter of trans. Thanks for watching.